San Diego might need a total rethink of how it approaches transportation, why SANDAG is sounding the alarm on growth and climate change. An ambitious redesign of Balboa Park may not happen, how the Plaza de Panama project turned out to be just too expensive. And the Board of Supervisors wants to take the Trump administration to court over its treatment of asylum seekers in San Diego. I'm Andrew Bowen, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Andrew Bowen, in for Mark Zauer, and joining me today at the KPBS Roundtable are Andrew Keats, Assistant Editor and Senior Investigative Reporter for Voice of San Diego, and Sarah Libby, Managing Editor for Voice of San Diego. Also, Charles Clark, Politics and County Government Reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune, and Jennifer Van Grove, Growth and Development Reporter also for the San Diego Union Tribune. Well, who knew stopping climate change would be so darn hard? San Diego will have to make deep and fundamental changes to its transportation network to meet the state's goals for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. That came straight from the mouth of the county's top transportation official this past week. He says SANDAG will need an extra couple of years to come up with a plan that gets enough people out of cars to comply with state law. Now, Andy, let's start with the goals. What are the goals that have been set for San Diego County to reduce its carbon footprint?
Yeah, so San Diego County, much like the other 4 large metropolitan areas in the state, got a target last year. It was given to them of 19% reduction from 2005 levels by 2035, which is pretty steep, but you know, wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility. Those 4 agencies had lobbied previously to the state to get a little bit lower. They thought they might be able to hit 18%. 19% proved to be a bridge too far.
And so those are the state goals, but we've also got some local goals for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. What about those?
So the city of San Diego, for instance, has its own climate action plan. That plan would halve our carbon footprint by 2035 as well. 50% reduction, so bigger than that. Now, granted, it is a bigger reduction, but limited to the more urban area of the city. So it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison. But then downstream from that, within that plan also is a commitment to get essentially half of the people who live within areas that are very close to transit stations to commute by some means other than a car, either walking, biking, or taking transit.
And so we know that transportation is the biggest driver of climate change here locally and statewide. What has to change in order to meet these statewide goals?
Well, one way to frame it is that you have to get people out of their car. The other thing you could do is simply allow them to drive less, or to have them, when they drive cars that produce fewer emissions. So any combination of those things would work. It just turns out that the actual transportation networks that the county has long been proposing, that people have been fighting over, that local officials have been kind of angling for funds from one source or another over, all of those things, no matter which way you arrange them, no matter how you cut it, aren't enough to get to the level. So this was basically the truth bomb moment where the director said, all this stuff that we've been talking about all this time is not enough. We might be able to do it another way, but the things we've been discussing aren't going to get us there.
So that's Hassan Prada. He's the new director of the San Diego Association of Governments, which plans transportation in the county. So that was his message to the mayors and city council members who sit on the SANDAG board.
Yeah.
How did they react to the news?
It was interesting. I mean, it was pretty much just stunned silence in a lot of ways. There was a couple different people had different responses. People said that they were a little bit concerned about the idea of delaying for 2 whole years where it was going, but you didn't get the sort of pushback that you might have expected, which was kind of raging against the state, the unfairness of the state mandates, or simply asserting their lack of a desire to follow through with this, or anything like that. It was sort of taking it all in. They did not seem to be expecting that news, and then they were sort of asking, is there a way we could do this faster? Do we really need to wait all the way until 2022 just to adopt this plan?
Because there are some risks involved with waiting that long, aren't there?
Yeah, so you have to have one of these plans. This is not just a bureaucratic exercise. You must have it to be eligible for state funding, to be eligible for federal funding. So our period where we need to have one is coming up at the end of this year. If things hadn't changed in November of 2019, we would be adopting this new plan. They already had admitted that that wasn't going to happen, but they were angling more for like a 6-month delay, something that would be potentially risky, potentially would subject us to a loss of state funds or federal funds, but something they'd be able to manage, something that would be just an administrative task. A 2-year delay makes that much harder, which is why they're now asking, they say they're going to ask some legislators at the state level to carry legislation that may basically say it's okay that San Diego missed this deadline, and that they're going to start lobbying the federal government to see if there's some sort of administrative fix. The risk is you can't get funding for state and federal projects, and all of the local projects that we build, every freeway, every transit line, every trolley line is helped along by some significant portion of state or federal funding. We don't do it all alone with local funds. So if you lose that money, you may have to say goodbye to these projects, or you might have to delay the timeline and delivery of those projects.
And so, on that issue of funding, we know that a plan is really only as good, it's only good if you can actually build it. And you can only cut greenhouse gas emissions if you can build this new transportation network. So is this new network something that SANDAG could even afford?
They won't be able to afford it at all without some new amount of local funding. Transnet, the local sales tax that they use to pay for these sorts of large regional projects, is by and large tapped out. The SANDAG has been coming to grips with this reality over the last 2 years. They still think that they'll be able to build all the projects that they've promised in there, although Hassan Akrada, the new director, has acknowledged that that itself is not a sure thing by any stretch of the imagination. But they won't be able to build anything beyond that. And even the things within that they're building are the early action projects, some of the fast-tracked promises there. So, the Midcoast trolley line that's under construction, they'll finish that. The South Bay BRT that has recently opened and that has another phase, they'll finish that. There will be some other projects, but some of the things at the end of that list will be cut off, and anything beyond that that's going to be the make up the brunt of this plan that they say needs to be fundamentally different, there's no real idea for how to fund those things, and it'll come from some new tax increase, whether it's the measure that MTS is discussing now, or a future SANDAG one, or 2 future SANDAG ones, or another state gas tax. I mean, it will require more funding than is in the realm of possibility today.
And so there was a bit of other news that dropped in the transportation realm this week. Governor Gavin Newsom, in his State of the State address, said that the high-speed rail link would between San Francisco and LA would essentially be a pipe dream. Let's hear what he had to say about that.
But let's be real. The current project, as planned, would cost too much and respectfully take too long. There's been too little oversight and not enough transparency. Right now, there simply isn't a path to get from Sacramento to San Diego, let alone from San Francisco to LA. I wish there were.
Now, Sarah, you were at that speech, and there was a bit of confusion over what those words actually meant, wasn't there?
Yeah, it seems like the only thing that's clear is that at least rhetorically, it's a major shift for a governor to be speaking this way. It's not something we ever heard from Governor Jerry Brown. In the chamber when he was delivering that speech, it was, one of the biggest reaction lines of the day. So certainly the people who were there at the time thought it was a big deal. It's become really unclear since then whether policy-wise he's really changing all that much, and he's kind of come out and said that he's not, but there's a lot of confusion.
And so what role will the state's high-speed rail project actually play in meeting the state's climate goals?
So I think, if you take what Andy was saying about how ambitious San Diego needs to be in order to hit its own goals, I think the same is true for California statewide. So whether it's high-speed rail or whether it's some other mix of huge, big projects that are total reimagining of how we get around, a Hyperloop or something on that scale, it's going to take not just one big thing, but many big things.
And President Trump never misses a chance to drag liberal California on Twitter. He tweeted this week that it was a green disaster, this high-speed rail project. What was the governor's response to that?
So he responded in kind that was fake news. Although the governor, in responding to all this confusion about what he actually plans to do with high-speed rail, himself had kind of a Trumpian response today where he essentially blamed the media for all of the confusion. He said it wasn't my speech that was confusing, it was the media's reaction to it.
What's your take? Do you think it was the media who got it wrong, or Newsom should have been clearer?
I think he certainly characterized his plan as massively scaling back high-speed rail, and so if that's not what he actually intends to do, I think he should have said so more clearly.
Yeah. Well, we do have to move on, and our next segment is about Balboa Park. Well, taking a stroll through Balboa Park's Plaza de Panama would be a lot more pleasant if there were no cars around. Pretty much everyone agrees on that, but a plan to divert cars to a new underground paid parking garage, that's been a tough sell both politically and financially. News broke this week that a rising price tag has put the project on hold again. So, Jennifer, this idea has been around for quite a while. Tell us about its history and what it would actually do.
So it dates back to August 2010 when Irwin Jacobs, co-founder of Qualcomm, came out with this plan to remove cars from Balboa Park Central plazas. And the plan was backed by the time by the mayor, Jerry Sanders at that time. And it's had a long, tortured history since then. So it was approved by City Council. There was a lawsuit in between, but in 2012 it was approved by City Council. At the time, it was a $45 million project. And then it was sued, and then it was approved by City Council again in November of 2016. It was sued, and then it was going forward as of October, actually even as of January. And the big controversial pieces are obviously the bypass bridge, which would get the people off of the
Cabrillo Bridge.
The eastern end of Cabrillo Bridge. So you'd be able to drive in, and then there'd be a bypass bridge that would loop you around to the other side to Spreckles Organ Pavilion. The parking lot that's there now, there would be an underground parking lot there. And that was also extremely controversial.
Yeah, and so this, as you mentioned, this project has been held up in court more than once. What were those legal challenges about?
They varied. So you could argue that the legal challenges were technicalities. So there was environmental review issues with Soho. And then San Diego.
Save Our Heritage organization
Save Our
that
Heritage.
tries to preserve architecture.
Absolutely.
And things like that.
And, really, but their issue was just, okay, so this bypass bridge is going to destroy the look of Balboa Park from that western side. And it's an interesting argument to contemplate. But they thought that there was more environmental review that needed to be required. And they lost that suit. And then Corey Briggs with San Diegans for open government sued based on the legality of the bonds. So the city was going to be responsible for $49 million of the project that was approved in 2016 because it ballooned to a $79 million project. And the way that they were going to secure those bonds or pay for the bonds was through lease revenue. Sorry, I'm misspeaking, but they were going to pay for it through lease revenue bonds, and those bonds were secured by what they were going to charge for the underground parking garage. And Corey thought that those were illegal. He also thought that there was some impropriety in how Mayor Kevin Faulconer, who is now very supportive of this plan, was promising the Plaza de Panama committee, which is the nonprofit raising money. He was giving them naming rights for certain elements in the park, and Corey took issue with that as well.
And so, these lawsuits were all ultimately unsuccessful, but they were successful in delaying the project. And then, last month we find out how much this is going to cost. What happened there?
Well, that was super interesting. So the city put this out to bid. The construction bids came in. And so for the construction portion, the city had approved $75 million of that $79 million budget. The lowest bid for, the basest of features was $83.5 million, and that went all the way up to over $100 million for that one single bid. And the city kind of Christina Chadwick with the mayor's office, we had lots of conversations about it. And there was some sort of tension between, what the actual bid was, but realistically, we're talking $100 million construction bid. And the Plaza de Panama committee, which is responsible for the nonprofit portion of the funds, they were also responsible for any cost overruns. And so they would be responsible for coming up with that difference between the $75 million number, and they just weren't interested in doing that.
And so they decided to then just halt their fundraising activities. So some advocates have said that, this goal of making the Plaza de Panama pedestrian only could be accomplished a lot more quickly and cheaply if we just shut the bridge off to cars and forget about the parking garage. Why not just do that?
You know, that's been something people have talked about since 2010, and it's still a very valid point, and I get emails about it all the time from readers, and I don't have the answer, and I don't know that the city has the answer. I think that they were just so gung-ho once they cleared the lawsuits of moving forward, and there is money allocated from the city, which we can get into later, but, you know, it was just like, this is what we're doing, and this is what what Jacobs wanted, and he was always the major fundraiser behind this, so I don't have a clear answer on that.
Yeah, Andy.
So I think one of the issues is that some of the neighborhood groups in the Bankers Hill area on the western side of the park think if you shut down that bridge, it'll push the people, instead of just driving all the way around the park, they'll park in our community, and so that it's run into some essentially NIMBY opposition there.
From the stuff that I saw, and that makes sense totally, but from the stuff that I saw, people were really advocating for like temporary closures, right? So one-time off things. But.
And the museums in Balboa Park are also kind of concerned about, you know, if we push the parking to the outer edges of the park, then people might not come to the museums, right?
Well, and yes, and then when you get into the underground parking garage, which was always going to be a for-charge lot, I think $8 to $12 to park there, then you have an issue of, are we cutting off access to the public, to maybe lower income individuals who can't afford those rates, because that would be the only place to really park in the park if this plan went forward. And so that was extremely controversial as well. That was certainly a derailing factor here.
Yeah, Andy.
Well, I mean, I think that, one of the things that you see here with the park is, and most issues with the park, is there are just so many different stakeholders there, and they all have ever so slightly different interests. And so they tried to make this grand compromise that had a lot of moving pieces and was very, I think fair to say, over-engineered as a way to solve everybody's problems. And then in the end, it didn't really. But you had, as you say, the institutions kind of demanded that there be some car access because they were very concerned about what it would mean for people at the Old Globe and the Museum of Man if you couldn't drive right through there. And so and they very strongly believe that there needs to be substantially more parking. And if you stack all these different problems on top of each other, you start to get yourself to this being the only solution. The problem is it opens up a bunch of other different problems. So it's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. Or whatever.
And Jen, now Balboa Park has a long laundry list of unfunded needs. So is there a debate going on about whether this is really something the city should prioritize, or should we be fixing the roofs and all those buildings?
I think there's always been that debate, and I keep trying to schedule a tour to kind of like go through the park and get a sense of what all these deferred maintenance costs are. There is the sense, though, that the mayor, who, when he confirmed that the Plaza de Panama committee will no longer be fundraising on this, he said that, the city will invest in Balboa Park. So there is a sense that, maybe he'll put some of the money that's been set aside towards kind of the basic projects of upgrading the restrooms and repairing the buildings. And there's a project going on right now with the California Tower, kind of retrofitting that for earthquake protection.
Yeah. Well, so maybe possibly the Plaza de Panama will be on hold for a while. It could always just rise again. Who knows?
You never know. The committee was like disbanded before, and then it resurfaced. So you never know, and they're reluctant to say that the project is dead. But
yeah. So we do have to move on to some news at the border, and this one is not about the wall. For years, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has run a so-called safe release program for legal asylum seekers. They enter the country claiming persecution at home, and the government makes an effort to connect them with sponsors or family members. ICE quit that practice a few months ago and started dumping asylum seekers in San Diego County with no effort to keep them sheltered. Not so fast, said the County Board of Supervisors, who voted this week to challenge that policy change in court. So, Charles, let's start with the reason for this shift in policy. Why does ICE say that they stopped this safe release program?
Right, so they kind of gave two reasons. Initially this stopped back in October, and part of what they pointed to was, there's so many more family migrant units at the border. The other line that they've kind of, said repeatedly, and the Homeland Security Secretary has said, is that, she put some blame on Congress for, and the courts for forcing them to not be able to detain children past 20 days. Which means that you're having to release more and more of them more quickly.
And that goes back to the family separation issue.
Right, yeah. So those were kind of the two factors that they seem to contribute to this.
Now, there was a coalition of nonprofits that swooped in after this policy change happened to shelter these asylum seekers. What have they been doing?
Right, so the San Diego Rapid Response Network, they quickly opened a shelter. They've had to move 5 times, and they're about to move into their 6th and now hopefully final location through the end of the year. That's actually a county-provided building. But what they're doing is really, not only providing shelter, but they're providing the resources to connect these people to, their sponsors who are often not in the state of California and certainly not in San Diego.
And this was all work that the government used to be doing.
Exactly, yeah. So they're really picking up where the government left off, and that's what you've seen with, a lot of different nonprofit groups and even some localities across, these border cities.
So as you kind of hinted at, both the county and the state have stepped in to help these nonprofits out. What did they do?
Right, so the county, it's been kind of a gradual shift since the new border supervisors were sworn in, but initially what they did was they set up a task force and they started looking at potential county properties that could be used as a shelter for these family migrants. They then, a few weeks ago, approved a temporary shelter at the old county family courthouse building. So they're moving the rapid response network in there. They're going to be providing the services out of that. At the same time, the county has also been providing public health screenings for the different migrants,
which costs staff hours, money, and
right,
things like that.
Right,
yeah.
And that's where typically the county points to as their biggest cost in all of this.
So let's move on now to talk about this lawsuit. The county has voted to sue the Trump administration, and we have a soundbite here from Supervisor Diane Jacob, who spoke to KPBS this week about the planned lawsuit.
But this is the federal government's responsibility. And by filing the lawsuit, the intent is to send a very strong message that it's costing us money, and it's not right and it's not fair for agencies in San Diego County to be picking up the tab and taking care of asylum seekers, which is responsibility of the federal government.
Now, Charles, there was one vote against filing this lawsuit. That came from Supervisor Kristen Gaspar. Why did she explain why she voted no?
Yeah, so she put out a statement, and essentially what she got at was, she pointed to a few things. One, she said she didn't feel that the lawsuit would go anywhere. She also said, she believes in real fixes rather than legal grandstanding. So she certainly seemed to suggest she thought this was more political posturing, which I think a lot of people would say is kind of ironic given the county's past involvement with some Trump-affiliated lawsuits.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that.
Led by Kristen Gaspar.
Yeah, so the County Board of Supervisors has 4 Republicans, 1 Democrat now. They've sided with the Trump administration on other immigration-related issues, haven't they?
Right. So they joined, to much controversy at the time as part of the Trump administration's lawsuit against the so-called sanctuary state laws in California. I think Supervisor Gaspar aside, I know speaking with Supervisor Jacob, she kind of made a point that, these are 2 different issues. Although they both deal with immigration, one had to do with, undocumented immigrants, whereas the other, has to do with people who are here following the proper legal process.
Now, the Trump administration, there's another kind of layer to this. They recently started sending asylum seekers who were entering the country from Mexico back to Mexico to wait for their court dates in that country. Is that at all impacting how many people are ending up, being dumped out on our streets in San Diego County?
Yeah, so, that's really, I think, the big overarching question with all of this as we kind of move forward is, it took them a while before they actually started implementing the Remain in Mexico policy. I know our colleagues over at the Union Tribune, they recently reported that 73 people have since been sent back to Mexico to wait for their asylum claims. And literally on Wednesday, they finally started sending family units back. That's going to be legally challenged, and the ACLU just yesterday actually filed a lawsuit trying to prevent the Remain in Mexico policy. I think in the interim, we're all going to have to wait and see how this actually plays out and impacts what we're seeing on the ground here in San Diego. I know the supervisors certainly didn't think that it would make the problem go away.
And so you've been covering the county for a while. Were you at all surprised by this lawsuit and the vote?
So a little bit. I think, Supervisor Jacob, she really, announced that this was something she'd be pursuing back at the beginning of the month. So that kind of caught us off guard initially. I think seeing the support for it didn't surprise me quite as much. And I think it's mainly because, you know, regardless of where you stand on the immigration issue, this certainly has an impact here in San Diego. And I think the supervisors, they can look at it as far as a public health problem. There's also, you know, the fiscal impact on them. And then, you know, even within their, you know, different kind of ways of looking at it, they can find something that they'll latch onto as, you know, the reason that they support this.
Yeah, they could just say, you know, it's about us protecting our taxpayers.
Exactly, yeah, which, you know, interestingly, you know, Supervisor Desmond, he actually put out a statement that said pretty much exactly that. So,
and one not known for his opposition to Republican policies or the Trump administration or anything. He's a true red Republican.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this lawsuit has to be filed in 30 days, is it? So any idea how long it could take to play out in court?
So we don't really know that yet. We know they're going to file it in 30 days. I think the other thing that'll be interesting to watch is do they get other communities to join in to this lawsuit? Have a feeling that communities like El Paso certainly would be interested.
We're just about out of time on this now, and that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. A big thank you to our guests, Andrew Keats and Sarah Libby from Voice of San Diego, and Jennifer Van Grove and Charles Clark from the San Diego Union Tribune. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Andrew Bowen, in for Mark Zauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.